You'll have to forgive me. I'm still like 3 weeks into a cold, so coughing lots and whatever. So you'll have to tolerate me. Sorry. It's definitely not COVID, don't worry. So imagine a thing where with human faces I get to kind of stand up, use and not worry about being on mute, use my clicker and everything. That's quite exciting. So elephant in the room, policy is a dull thing. It's kind of hard to make it sound sexy, but I'm at least going to try and get your attention. So bear with me. So to set the scene, I'm in a lift, and yes, any American friends, if you're in the room, we do really call them lifts. And 4 people walk in. I think to myself, Chris, this is your moment, now or never. As the doors close, I position myself in front of them, a captive audience. They're mine. I've got them. I hear the doors seal shut behind me, and I take a breath. I look to the first person on my left. She's in a suit. She looks really important to. I gesture to her, see? She looks back at me as if to say, yes, go on. She nods, perfect, the CIO, the policymaker, the one whose neck is on the block. Well, what are the chances of finding you in my imaginary lift today? I ask her, well, what keeps you up at night? She tells me, I don't know what teams are really doing what the volume of risk is, and what I should be showing more interest in. Setting and changing policy is slow and hard to communicate, and people just go off and do their own thing. They think they know better, and to be honest, often they do. But I'm then left playing catch-up with the risk that they've signed me up to. Okay, I say, trying not to sound like a patronising snake oil salesman, I can help. I turn my attention to the second person, also in a suit, but look less important. I make a guess. Let's face it, this is my imagination. It'd be weird if I was wrong. Product manager, I say. They nod. The whip cracker. Well, what's important to you? So managing risk, mostly opportunity risk, the fear of missing out, so getting features out the door and avoiding getting bogged down with, there's a glance to the CIO, bureaucracy that seems almost designed to slow me down. Awesome, I say, this is your lucky day. I turn to the next person, dressed in overalls. I'm in a trendy part of town. They could be the CTO, but before I ask, they sense me staring at them. Cleaner, they say. Huh. How did you get in my imagination? I'll come back to you. My attention goes to the last person, hoodie, headphones around their neck. My stereotypical developer. Yes, I know you well. What code do you write, I ask? Well, it doesn't matter. Python, cool. Have you got everything updated to work with, I pause, Python 3, they say? Yes, Python 3. Well, that must have been kind of super hard. They don't know it yet, but I've kind of just implicitly kind of won a bit of their trust. Nearly, they say, cool. Well, what's important to you? So staying on top of kind of patching stuff so we can react to the next fire, knowing what rules exist, what ones I can bend, break, and what might then cause me to lose my job. Writing consistent, good quality code and avoiding technical debt, so the rest of my team all been able to cohesively work as though we were one. Do you use any tools to help you with that, I ask? Well, yes, say linters, code quality, test coverage, the usual kind of gamut. Great, I say, well, I write code too, let's be friends. I hand them a printed QR code and say, here's my public GPG key, so you know that you can trust what I have to say. I return my focus to the cleaner. I've got it. How do you get told what to do and when it changes? Well, we get a memo, or something maybe stocks for notice boards. So last week we got a memo saying that all the meeting room whiteboards needed to be cleaned every night. Interesting, I say. How does that work out? Well, it's then up to us to maintain the to-do list so we can then onboard new people and keep a run of what we're supposed to do. Does it go wrong at all? Yeah, so sometimes when we compile our operational manual and we miss a memo or don't apply them in sequence, we inevitably get things wrong. They glance apologetically to the product manager, like when we hadn't updated the guide that the meeting room on the 3rd floor was being used as a dedicated war room, and we wiped all their boards down. I look to the dev. Does that sound familiar? I ask. They nod. Turns out we're all special snowflakes, eh? All is not lost. I knew that there was a reason that I imagined you here today. So the lift is slowing, and I feel it coming to its destination. Great, I've got the silver bullet for you too. The CIO looks to me, ready to buy literally whatever it is I'm selling. And they ask me as the doors open, well, who are you and what team are you in? As I move out of the way to stop obstructing the door, I answer, I don't actually work here. I'm just here to fix the lift. And people have been complaining that it only goes to the top floor, no matter what button they push, and it's actually pretty slow. My audience storms out, furious, heading towards the stairs. The door's shut, and I get back to my job. Okay, so if any of this sounds at least kind of vaguely familiar and you can relate to at least one of my imaginary friends, then maybe I might have some answers for you. So what if I said you could update policy easily, even releasing several version updates, not just in a year or in a month? What about 10 updates in a single day, and seamlessly communicate those to the people that need to consume it without derailing them? You could have visibility on compliance using tools that you perhaps already use. and that policy could be readily consumable, easy to pass, and demonstrate compliance and make sense and not be bureaucratic to change when it needs to, and ultimately not get in the way. That same policy could be treated as a dependency and operate like a linter, so that you can run compliance checks locally in CI and then onwards kind of guard production. Multiple versions of the policy, like a dependency, can be supported. So emergencies like you must update now because there's some known vulnerability type updates in an older version are a business as usual activity to communicate. Sound interesting? Cool. Okay. Just about doing all right for time. Cool. We can unlock the doors now. I think I've got them. So I've hopefully at least got some of your attention. It's time to at least introduce who I am and start explaining things. So my name is Chris Nesbitt-Smith. I'm currently an instructor for Learn K8s. And also Control Plane, a consultant to the Crown Prosecution Service generally, and a tinkerer of open source. I've spent a fair chunk of my kind of professional career now working in UK government and large organisations where problems like these are rife. I've been promised we'll hopefully have some time for plenty of questions at the end and heckles, even if I run way over. If not, come find me somewhere where there's food and drink afterwards. I'll be the obvious as the one in pink trousers. So, given I've got the luxury of a live audience today, and most of you have got your clothes on for a change, which is terrific, thank you very much. By show of hands, who's with my CIO and has set, written, or applied some policy before? Of any sort, so some coding standards for your team, or some guidance of who should be doing what on a cluster, whatever it might be. Cool, fair few of you. Okay. And you can put your hands down. So, how many of you have sought exemption or consciously bent, broken, circumvented, ignored, bypassed, whatever a policy with at least some good intentions? Cool, thank you. Excellent. Well, you fell for it. So we've got all your names and employers' details down, thanks to the organisers of the conference, so lend me your ears, the stakes just got raised. So where do I see the policy as code going wrong? Well, before we dig into that, what do I mean by policy? Well, it usually comes in one of two forms. So security enforcing, like data at rest being encrypted, or consistency enforcing, such as code style, so tabs being 2 or 4 space indentated, maybe. Or maybe you can think of some others, but in any case, it's hopefully intended to mitigate a risk of some sort. However, with the best of intentions, these are often emotionally led, rather than being grounded in a proportionate control, which can often find itself as being the open door to case-by-case exemptions being required when you come against a situation that you weren't anticipating. So this is not unlike how the laws of the land are created, with case law making for a complex-to-navigate rulebook and harder still to then measure compliance. It often looks like the thin end of a wedge, where the precedent, which may have been an uncomfortable pill to swallow the first time round, becomes dangerous, with then others looking to expand upon its scope, which can lead us to sometimes wonder if the cure was actually worse than the disease. But that's not how we at least typically develop software, so why does this all have to be so hard? There must surely be a better answer. We've codified everything else, so isn't that it? Well, yes, in part, but my point of this talk is that we do it wrong. So maybe some of you are screaming or even representing your favourite product at me as the solution to this, and you're not wholly wrong, but the devil's in the detail. Throwing some curly braces or YAML at something doesn't inherently fix things. If it's a security control, it's often tempting to keep that policy a secret, so exposing it could be used maybe against you by an adversary. However, this does not support us shifting left at all. It results in devs effectively reverse engineering what the policy is by finding out when we smash our heads up against it. So it doesn't therefore take much imagination to see that in the scenario of, say, an application deploy, midway through finding one resource is non-compliant and becomes rejected, would leave the overall deploy in an inconsistent state, likely resulting in some downtime. Which begs the question of, was that policy better than the downtime? Especially if it leaves your engineers, who are all hopefully plenty smart, in finding inventive, shall we say, ways around the computer says no response that they've got. This is then further exacerbated when updates to the policy are desired. So maybe you get a pen test or something goes wrong. So you form this new case law and need to apply a new policy. So maybe all S3 buckets now need to be encrypted, a change that could be considered breaking. Sure, you might say you provide warnings on at least, say, the less important issues or new emerging policy changes, which is great, so long as someone sees them. But if you've adopted GitOps or at least CI/CD, is anyone seeing those warnings? I mean, who studies the results of a successful build log every time? Anyone? Every time? Well, if you are, I politely suggest that you're probably missing the point of CI/CD. You should be able to trust your job status. Okay, well, I'm not just here to throw some stones. So remember my implied promises to my four imaginary friends of what this promised land might look like. Well, there's nothing new under the sun. We've actually already unwittingly solved all of these problems elsewhere. We just need to be reminded and encouraged to join the dots. Well, the first is something that if you're doing policy as code, you may already find yourself being doing. So put it in version control. The thing you might not be doing, though, is making that then visible. So at least inner source it, by which I mean allow anyone within your kind of walled garden of employees, suppliers, etc., to see the policy. I'm not saying kind of give all your threat monitoring and intel rules away. You can probably keep that to yourself. But what I'd argue is the visible policy and the gaps therein is often better than the downtime, reverse-engineered workarounds, and opaque legacy exemption spaghetti soup that you will emerge otherwise. If you're brave, you might even open source it. You'll find it unlocks an ability to work well with prospective suppliers and without NDAs and whatnot, and widely distributed secrets are expensive to maintain, difficult to handle, and often only stay secret for so long after all. Okay, so we're off to a good start. Our policy is visible now, so those that need to see it. So many of you, no doubt, kind of familiar with semantic versioning, but a quick recap in context to this. So the first segment is used to indicate breaking perhaps conflicting changes. So in the context of policy, let's say it's requiring resources to have a department label. Maybe that will keep some internal kind of cross-charging or whatever, who knows, I'm not judging here. And increments that might look like requiring that to be from a predetermined list rather than being free text. The second segment is to indicate minor changes. These shouldn't break anyone. So in increments that might look like correcting a spelling mistake on one of those department names from the list. Third segment is to indicate patch changes. So these should be a no-brainer for everyone to keep up to date with. And increments that might look like adding a department to the available options. Okay, so our policy is visible in a repository, its version, so we can easily communicate the policy, we can tack on release notes, and expectations are all being managed by Semver. In software, we're used to handling dependencies. So what if your policy was just another dependency? You might unwittingly already be doing this if, for example, you have, say, ESLint as a dependency in your JavaScript package, perhaps. Okay, so our policy is visible, it's in a repo, it's version, we can easily communicate the policy, we can tack on the release notes and all the expectations of Semver. It's all beginning to look a bit more like software. Okay, so I know this is a dirty word, but in order to give this, make this an asset that everyone can depend on and also provide some known good examples for your documentation, tests are essential to give everyone confidence in the stability and surface any potential side effects before they then hurt everyone involved. Consumers of this policy need to be able to test themselves against the policy locally and in CI/CD, thus shortening the feedback loop and then better informing them. So as a bonus, we should be able to find our consumers able to rely on the artifact that we're sharing with them. Well, we're well and truly on the home stretch. It's a dependency, so updating it should be no different to any other. And we can even use some magic like GitHub's Dependabot or Men's Renovate to do that for us. So think automatic pull request tests, even auto-merging if you like. Okay, so to check you're all still awake, can anyone tell me a recent, well, not so recent anymore, but event that caused everyone to want to know what version of a certain logging Java doohickey you were potentially running literally everywhere in the estate? Bingo. Yeah, as you know, all presentations this year are contractually required to reference Log4j or Shell4j, and even when it's almost entirely out of context, and include some memes. So in just a few short months, I can hopefully remove these and just point broadly at a list of scary-looking CVEs in order to command your behavior through fear. But what I'm getting at here, though, is that the situational awareness piece around software supply chain is something that your organizations are hopefully already thinking about, if not already addressing. So if your policy is a dependency, this is at least not a new problem. So software bill of materials for the win, perhaps, which can allow us to then measure the compliance across the estate. Okay, so I've just covered quite a lot of ground quite quickly and hopefully sounded at least vaguely convincing and not just a fictional utopia painted in PowerPoint. It's time to look at how you might be actually able to do this, and I know you all really came here wanting to see a million words on a slide and not just the odd emoji or two. So we've reached the point where I get to show you some code. Hooray! But to maintain scope, I'm going to limit this to talking about two things to prove that this is not just one tech or one tool. I've arbitrarily picked Terraform and Kubernetes, but I could have probably picked anything. Naturally, I'll need some tools to go along with this. I'm too lazy to invent much here. So likewise, I'm going to pick 2 tools, but again, I could use some or even all probably. So Chekhov's going to be doing my Terraform and Kyverno's going to be doing my Kubernetes. If you want to browse along with me, I've created an example GitHub organization here. I'm not expecting you to read or grok the code on screen necessarily, so don't worry about it too much. It's just to prove that I made a thing that's at least vaguely real. So the policy is stored here. So here's where my policy starts at version 1.00. I've got a policy that requires a department label on all resources. So as long as it's set, it doesn't matter what it is. It's free text. I've written tests for this, so note how the passing test cases are usable as a great example of what good and bad looks like. We've pushed a tag in Git, we've added release notes, I can sign it to provide further assurance if my heart so desires, which of course it does, but moving on. Version 2.00 looks similar, only now that department field has to be from a predetermined list. Like before, tests exist, release notes are written, tags are signed. 2.10 is where we notice and correct that spelling mistake of one of the options in that list of departments. And 2.11, I've now added a new department to the list. Okay, so there's a few more repositories in that organization apart from the policy one. So there's app1 and infra1. Well, these depend on version 1.00 of the policy. It's not compliant with version 2 or beyond, but how do I know that? Well, I've configured Renovate in this case to be automatically making me a pull request. So when there's a new version of the policy, it's super obvious if I can update that dependency, and I can also see clear feedback about where and why I'm not compliant. I can see all the pull requests over the org, so I could actually use this to measure the compliance of my policy too. Moving on from that, there's a few more repositories to talk about in that org. So there's app2 and infra2. Well, these depend on version 2.00 of the policy. However, we could merge that open pull request all the way up to 2.11. And finally, last couple of repositories there, app3 and infra3. Well, they're dependent on 2.11, and they get a gold star from the CIO. There is a small touch of magic, and it's not pretty. I've written some bash. Don't judge me, even though I've probably, definitely, absolutely written a lot worse. But what this does is allows me from my dev laptop or in CI to evaluate my code against the version of the policy that's declared in the artifact. Ideally, this might be less cumbersome, but it is what it is for now. Pull requests are all very welcome on this. And the last piece of the puzzle is managing the life cycle of the policies and allowing multiple versions of the policy to be evaluated within a single runtime. I've cheated a bit here. Kubernetes gives you some admission controllers. It's not so easy, so far as I found, to get the same sort of policy evaluation in cloud. They've got their own policy code, and I've not figured out how to be able to evaluate that policy locally. Again, pull requests, collaboration, all very welcome. So you may have noticed the way the policy was designed and written is designed to be distributed, and distributed lends itself well to coexist with itself in a Kubernetes cluster. Which brings us to cluster 1, which describes a cluster that accepts all of the versions of the policy that we've described so far by deploying every single version of them concurrently in the cluster. Likewise, there's cluster 2. Well, this accepts version 2.00 and greater. And we can automate all of this using Kind, just to prove the point, in CI to deploy our applications and demonstrate how that works. So there we have it. A full org, all done, all compliant, policy, all versions, CIO, all aware of what's going on. This is looking great, right? But just one more thing. Wouldn't it be awesome if the policy carried a story about why it exists? After all, if your agile team is even half effective, it will reject anything that it perceives as friction if it doesn't see the value in it. It could allow our devs to know why they're compliant and to do something outside of what the policy permits. They don't therefore need any sort of exemption granted per se. They could actually have a well-reasoned and informed debate with rationale behind a pull request to the policy. After all, if your agile team is even half effective, it will reject anything that it perceives as friction if it doesn't see the value in it. Sorry, I hit the wrong button. So imagine, if you will, going through a stage of versions with risks that inform the mitigations manifested as policy all maintained as one. So when the risk landscape changes, your policies can move with it. So when some new privacy regulation comes out or your next marketing strategy pays off, so you acquire some maybe more data, for example, even if your policy was perfect at one time, the risks and the appetite for it will stand still for no one. So we can liken this to over-provisioning that we might be familiar with from elsewhere, where lead times are long, changes hard, and there is a significant pressure in nailing it the first time, which can lead us to hedging bets about what some future state might be, rather than kind of proportionate mitigation to the risks that are more tangibly in the real now. So that's where the real culture change is needed, and the execution of that is likely a long series of talks in of itself. So now this is all really over to you. Honestly, the best thing you could do right now is tell me that it's madness, already done, irrelevant, or otherwise unachievable, something my esteemed echo chamber of peers are yet to do. So beyond making pull requests and developing the theory more, I'd really like to start building some more case studies with more willing organisations and allow me to swap out more of my imaginary friends for some real ones. But the most important thing I want you to remember from our time together is, and please do feel free to say this out loud with me, that purposeless policy is potentially practically pointless policy, which I've been practicing saying far too many times. I've been Chris Nesbitt-Smith. Thank you so much for your time. You're now free to leave. I'll destroy the evidence of your guilt admissions earlier, maybe. Like, subscribe, whatever the kids do on LinkedIn and GitHub, whatever. You can be rest assured there'll be little, or no spam really, or much content at all, since I'm pretty awful at self-promotion on social media. CNS.me just points at my LinkedIn. Talks.cns.me contains this and other talks, and they are all open source. Questions are very welcome on this or anything else. I'll hold the stage as long as I'm allowed before Chris chucks me out of the room, or find me afterwards. I could probably do with something to eat and drink in a minute. Thank you very much.